I'm not going to joke about the difficulties of moderating a panel after lunch. It's quite banal. And I want to thank Dr. Dembski and Polish Institute of PISM for this invitation to moderate a panel which has such an important and grand title. Well, the best selection, of course, is a fourth-generation Muscovite who emigrated to Lithuania 8 years ago and has a German name. So I think that I'll start without further ado with, we have a great panel, and it's very geographically diverse, which is great because we're discussing a collective Western or the European Union, transatlantic community. And frankly, I would like to start, because we're here, because of Ukraine to a large extent, I would like to start with asking a question that may not be like immediately associated with this title. Is Ukraine part of the West? Who wants to begin? Nathalie. Yeah, everyone has their mics on their right. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. Mm-hmm. There is no question about it, I think. And I think there's no question about it. And I think this is probably what we're going to end up talking about for the next hour or so. Mm-hmm. The West is determined by what its values are. Mm. And Ukraine is fighting for its existence as a free and democratic country. And that is what the West stands for. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, Ukraine is more West than any of us all put together at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. Anyone? Yeah, Melissa, please.
I'll come in because I'm going to disagree, and you will
remember what I told you about the mic.
Absolutely.
Remember what I told you about the mic.
Absolutely.
Hold it like that.
Great.
Good.
So just to start, I should thank the organisers for the invitation to be here and for the best conference topic ever. I think we do talk a lot about the West as almost a self-evident grouping, whether you're pro-West or anti-West. We talk about it like that. And Nathalie, you've said it's about common values. Well, I come from a country, from Australia, which I'm sure we all think is part of the West, yes? We think it's part of the global north. But if you look on a map, the only thing we're west of is New Zealand, and the only thing we're north of is Antarctica. So it's something else going on. I'm, I suppose, sensitive to this idea that it could be a quite incoherent concept, and how do we apply it? So if I'm thinking about what the West is not, I would actually put common values in there. I say it's not based on a common history, it's not based on common culture, it's not based on common political system, and it's not based on common values. And I do have evidence. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if you're thinking about common history, you'd say, okay, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, we're all part of the West, everyone would put that. But what about Argentina and Brazil? Their history is absolutely identical, but we don't put them in there. Or if you're talking common culture, well, geopolitically, Japan, South Korea, they're part of the West. They certainly do not have the same culture. If you're saying common political systems, well, you know, we have large democracy like India, which we wouldn't usually put in this, whereas we have, I don't know, a communist country like Vietnam, which for many ways for us in Asia is a very important partner. And if I'm going straight on to the common values question, I'd say that, let me put it in terms of Europe. Europe is the most, EU is the most Western grouping you could imagine. But I hear rumours that you don't agree on absolutely everything. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't think we have a single set of common values. And I suppose if I was pushing
none at all
on that idea of Ukraine is the West because it's besieged, would it be different if a large country invaded a non-democratic country? Would that
Actually, interesting enough, I'll interrupt you. There's my question. I wanted to ask it to Nathalie. In 1991, the international coalition went to liberate Kuwait, which, well, is not a full democracy even now, but at that time, women there couldn't vote, and it was just a shaking them. And everyone agreed that Kuwait should be liberated. Probably it's not about, well, maybe full kind of framed as a fight for a country that wants freedom and democracy, but in fact, probably it's a fight for sovereignty, for the universal principle of sovereignty. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that, well, firstly, I think that there is, if there is a problematic term, I don't think it's the values part of it. I think it's the West part of it, for the basic kind of geographic reasons that you were highlighting. So, you know, the point is there is something, I mean, which we kind of commonly call the West, but we probably shouldn't be calling the West. And the point is, what is that something kind of kept together by? And I would still say it's values for the simple reason that when we start doubting whether that something actually exists, it's exactly when we start disagreeing about values. I mean, you know, I remember when was it? It was February 2020, just before COVID, another important security conference, the Munich Security Conference, and the title of it back then was Westlessness. What made us think back then that the West was westless, or that blob, that something that we call was westless, precisely because of a corrosion of values within our societies and between our societies. It's when the values, not when the interests collide, because we always disagree about something, but it's when the values start kind of fraying that we wonder whether that something actually exists. And to the question of, well, you know, 91, I would say that as part of that set of values, there are some fundamental ones like territorial integrity and sovereignty that are not exclusive to that blob that we call West, right? But that presumably are shared amongst the entire international community and form the bedrock of international law, that are, in a sense, a necessary, they're not a sufficient condition for the blob to be the blob West, right. but they're certainly pretty important.
Right. James, I know what you think in general, but could you elaborate? Here's your mic.
Well, thanks for reminding about the Westlessness.
Look from the other side of the pond.
Thanks for reminding about the Westlessness conference, which was the most stupid conference I ever attended. Look, I think it's much more fundamental. I think it's the free world, and I think there really are three fundamental things. I think for all our differences and disagreements, and we fundamentally believe in human rights, we fundamentally believe in popular sovereignty, and we fundamentally believe in some version of the free market system. And there's lots of sketches in that, but that's what we have. And why that's significant is because nations like Iran and China and Russia don't believe in any of those things. And they actually believe that those are obstacles to the expansion of their power and influence. And if the countries that do believe them don't stand and protect their own equities and their own competencies, then they're at risk. And I think that's what's driving the world today. I'm not going to dispute the debate about values. What I will dispute, and I think is fundamental, is the notion that there is a values-based order that is going to protect our values. I think Ukraine has demonstrated that's demonstrably false. We live in a world that is ruled by force. And the only people that will retain their values are people that can defend them. And I think that's what Ukraine has really showed us. And the only thing about the West, I would say, to me, the really, really interesting question, because the West is really global, right, is how much are we going to see kind of what I would call cross-theater cooperation, right? So how much interest is there in Asia in dealing with Russia and the issues of China? How much interest is there in Europe? And of course, we don't have international mechanisms to do this. So if there is, in a sense, real kind of global cooperation, that's really going to be led at kind of the national level. So for example, we see the Japanese and the Taiwanese and the South Korea being more prominent in Europe and caring about Europe. We see, you know, Britain and France being incredibly more active in the Indo-Pacific. To me, that's the really interesting dynamic that's going down today, and that's the one that's really going to shape the future of the West.
James, last but not least, definitely. It's on, I think.
Okay, good. Yes, I guess is Ukraine Western or part of the West? I mean, I think that depends on what the West means, and the West itself isn't a uniform thing, and it's changed over time. So in the Cold War, it was basically those countries which wanted to provide some degree of opposition or would not accept the Soviet Union, and it was structured under the geopolitical structures, primarily NATO, that were created in the late 1940s by Britain and the United States and extended then to the rest conquest of Western Europe, hence the West. If you'd have spoken to anyone in the English-speaking world about the West prior to that time, they wouldn't have really understood what you were talking about. Mm-hmm. But then in the 1990s, it seems that the idea of the West then mutated somewhat and assumed a kind of values, a number of different values, primarily liberalism, democracy, human rights, and acceptance of a particular type of rules-based international system. And I think in that sense, if that is now what the West is, the real innovation is actually not occurring in the Euro-Atlantic, it's actually occurring in the Indo-Pacific, primarily under a degree of Japanese thought leadership, and that is the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific. All countries that are supportive of a free and open international order in that region, in opposition of those potentially that seek to impose some kind of hegemony either regionally or over the entire system in that theatre. And in that sense, I think we need to modify the language we use. So in one sense, yes, Ukraine is becoming part of the West if it joins the Euro-Atlantic structures, at least in the old sense of what the West meant. But if we're talking about values and principles and support for a specific type of international order, then actually I think we all, in what is the Old West, need to change and adapt to understand that not only is the Euro-Atlantic changing, but it's also folding into a broader order controlled and shaped by affairs in the Indo-Pacific.
We mentioned several times the human rights, and we mentioned sovereignty. Well, if we're talking about, in the end, I think everyone agrees that a degree of values orientation is important to the West, because otherwise it's purely mechanical. So at the same time, if you look at Putin's assault on Ukraine, many people would say that essentially Ukrainians proved that values or ideas they stand for, like sovereignty, nation, and things like that, well, not part of the human rights kit, let's say, in some countries of the European Union, to put it very mildly. Basically, in this respect, when we say human rights, I mean, is it, well, in Poland there's one idea of human rights, and in the Netherlands it's completely different, for example, or in Japan for that matter. So what is the commonality of ideas? Let's remove the word values. Who wants to start? Yes.
I'm not sure there is one. You know, as I said, the West and the ideas behind it have changed and evolved over time. Yeah. I think
today.
Yeah, I think one thing that James said, which I agree with, is that values are really only important insofar as you can uphold them. And in order to uphold them, you actually need to have power. And power is central to that objective. So you can have as many values and stand for them as loudly as you can. But unless you have the means to protect them from those who wish to change them or undermine them, then really, you know, you're not going to last for very long. And we've seen this so many times before in the past. And today, Ukraine is fighting for its life, for its own values, its own principles, to exist as a nation, and whatever those are within Ukraine. But without that power, without that means to resist, the means to even extend those values, societies, I'm afraid, will not last for a very long time.
Can I? Yes, please. Yeah, I mean, to me, this is the real issue, which is, you know, it's like the guy that hasn't, or the girl that hasn't been to the gym in 10 years, right? It's getting back into shape, and it's sharpening our ability, and the key to survival in the world in which we live is sharpening our ability to understand the relationship between values and interests, right? And the common discussions that we would have in the Cold War of, well, this is a vital interest, I will fight and defend this. Well, this is an important interest. You know, I'll do that, but I'm not sending my boys to die. And this is, you know, I will help a peripheral interest, I help as I can. Those kinds of very hard discussions kind of evaporated for decades, and now we have to relearn that language and that thinking. We see that in the United States. We just had this kind of mini dust-up debate over supplemental funding for Ukraine, and it wasn't really about a discussion of where that fits in the hierarchy of interests. I mean, for Ukraine, for the U.S., that is not a vital interest. I mean, if Ukraine falls, as terrible and horrible as that is for Ukrainians, it is not a death blow to the United States. On the other hand, Ukraine is the first step in Russia destabilizing Western Europe, which, by the way, I think the Chinese would be happy to see. And it is important to us that Ukraine stand. And so there is this alignment of values and interests. And the debate in the bill was about, okay, what's the right allocation of an important interest? The problem is we never articulated that in this debate. And we've lost that language, and we have to get that language back. Otherwise, we just can't go into a room now and say, well, we live in a rules-based order. How do we get the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians to come back into the fold? Because that's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so we have to decide how we're going to allocate our interests and our resources to achieve what's important to our nation states. Those are hard discussions that we just weren't used to having for a very long time.
Since you mentioned, yes, Melissa, please, if you want to follow up, or because I have a question, and maybe that may touch upon what you want to say. Since you mentioned China and Russia and even Iran in one breath, question to all of you. I was quite, just like Francois said, as Francois said last evening, I was quite surprised to see how quickly, at least the US administration, and actually elements of European decision-makers, decision-making class, have figured out that you can't decouple Putin from Xi, China from Russia, because these things are interconnected. Not all of them, but quite a few people understand that. So can we say that, okay, not the value, of course, but the global West will be united in standing up to global authoritarian?
I know you're going to, Melissa. I just want to say that nobody's actually done this better in recent years than the Australians, who have really sorted through some very difficult geostrategic challenges to decide where they want to do to secure their country. And so I think Australia is an exemplar of the things, the kind of wake-up call that other people shouldn't have gotten a long time ago.
Well, Melissa, then maybe you will.
Yeah. Well, when you put it starkly like that, it sounds a little bit what Peter said in his introduction. You have a choice. You're either Western civilization or, if I've got these words right, you're part of the despotic kleptocracies. It's an either or. Countries have to decide and they have to choose. And that just doesn't work in Asia. And I want to explain why. Most countries in Asia would not consider themselves the West. So if you look at, say, the two largest democracies in the world, India and Indonesia, together, that's 1.6 billion people. They do not consider themselves the West. India has a proud history with a non-aligned movement. Indonesia is dynamic equilibrium, no enemies, variable geometry. They have a very strong idea of, what would you say, remaining somewhat neutral when you have great power conflicts, because they think that's the best strategy for them. I think the only countries or places that would see themselves unequivocally as the West would be, say, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan and Singapore. And of course this matters when you're talking about something like, say, the UN General Assembly resolution deploring the invasion of Ukraine. Out of the, 35 countries that abstained, 10 of those are in Asia. Okay, so some were Central Asia, which you'd expect, but you also have in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, because of their links with Russia. And you have a really weak ASEAN statement, which doesn't even mention the words Russia or invasion. So my view is that appealing to that idea of the West just doesn't work in Asia. And part of it, this is the tricky bit, if I can go a little bit longer on this.
Yes, a little bit, yeah.
Is because we tend to, when we say the words West, we say free world. I get it. I heard that, James. We leave out the legacy of colonialism, and you just can't in Asia. So when people in Asia are thinking about the West, they're not thinking about what we gave for the freedom to our own populations. They're thinking about the way that the West subjugated other populations. They're thinking not about our highest ideals, but about the way we didn't fulfil our highest ideals. Okay? And so if I'm being tough here, but if I look at this panel, every one of us comes from a country that colonised others, in Africa, in the Pacific, the sun never sets, and I would actually say the US potentially is still a colonising power given the relationships with islands in the West Pacific. And that's not to embarrass this group, I'm not trying to embarrass the group, but just think, how rare is it for us to acknowledge that? to not just talk in triumphal terms about how wonderful the West is.
I'll interrupt you here. Barack Obama did the same thing, going to Cairo and saying, forgive us for everything. And you know how it ended. The US empire was perceived as weak. Putin walked into Crimea, then he walked into
because
Syria.
He said
maybe
that in Cairo.
maybe we should look forward a little bit.
That was the direct result.
And leave the post-colonial studies to professors, if I may. Full disclosure, I'm more of a Wall Street Journal and Spectator reader than The Guardian. And
well,
with great respect to Stephen Erlang and the New York Times.
But I'm going to come back on that because it affects the relationship, okay? You may say, oh, that's far, far past. And I don't think people in Poland are going to agree with that, given how much history
Melissa,
matters.
Let me interrupt you. Yeah.
No, I want to give you a
last
real
phrase.
example.
Yeah.
I want to give you a real example. So Mike Pence goes to APEC and he says, we in the US have always extended our bonds across the Indo-Pacific with friendship and partnership. Okay. Now, your audience there thinks straight off, Philippines, Hawaii. When the US was a rising power, it did not use friendship and partnership. And there isn't a conversation you can have because if you don't understand your own history well enough, if that's the view you have of your history, how can there be a conversation between you and Asian powers? So I don't think you can sweep it under the carpet if you're going to have genuine relationships in Asia. And if you're pushing a triumphalist view of the West without humility, you are not going to get people in Asia on board.
I would like to come back to the original question, which was not about colonialism, but which was about
human rights and common values,
authoritarianism.
which are both of those things. You asked about human rights and common values. And
yeah, that was before. Yeah, but
Can I
Nathalie, yes, please,
I mean,
then James, and then I see that Jim also wants to maybe talk about America. Do you? Oh, if you don't, that's fine.
I mean, I do actually think that we should absolutely avoid falling into the trap of West versus rest. And the way in which we talk about the West, and in this respect, I absolutely agree, is fundamentally important. I actually do think that if there is one country that can make a very powerful argument about anti-colonialism, it's Ukraine. Indeed, I think that, people sitting on this panel would indeed be looked at with some degree of skepticism by making that argument. But Ukraine can and should, because I think indeed it's in our interests to break that mold of West versus rest. And it's in our interests actually to portray, especially if now in reference to the war in Ukraine, as a division at this point in time, which has to do with blob, which in shorthand we will call West, which is not quite West, but we know what we mean. Russia, Belarus, Eritrea, Syria, North Korea, full stop. And then there's a rest. In that rest, there are many shades of grey, the closest of which is China. But I think even in the case of China, where politically we're very much on the same page, and this goes back to the point about values, there's a reason why politically they're very much on the same page. But economically, there are kind of, cracks to work on there. And then again, various shades of grey. Then you get to India. I mean, frankly speaking, not exactly a shining example of a democracy these days. Let's be very frank about this, right? And very much, trying to sort of play in both camps. And yet there are cracks there that are in our interest to try and exploit. It's in our interest to try and break up that rest. And by talking about it in the West in a particular way, I don't think we're basically doing ourselves much of a favour.
Mm-hmm. James.
Yeah, I think there's two important issues here. One relates to an idea that emerged in the 1990s, and that is that there are some kind of teleological forces guiding the West and guiding forward the ideas like liberalism, democracy, and so on and so forth. And I think that was a completely destructive view, actually, and it allowed us to take our eye off the ball. That is, how do we construct a world order and maintain a world order that serves the interests of those very values. And remember also that there's a tension between liberalism and democracy. And in a liberal democracy, that tension has been to some extent reconciled, but it can from time to time, and I think it has in both the UK and the US over the last few years. That tension has manifested and become apparent again. And in recent years, perhaps more recently, it is closed down. But that leads me to the second point I want to make, and that is, and it sort of touches on some of the issues that the other panelists have raised. And it was raised by the British head of the Secret Intelligence Service a few weeks ago. And he asked, what is our counter-offer to the world? Can anyone actually answer that? That does mean, of course, understanding what others want, whether they're in the Indo-Pacific, the Euro-Atlantic, or for that matter, Africa or South America. But it also means being able to provide that intellectual leadership to ensure that the values that we hold dear and we think are potentially universal and deliver the best form of political and economic government, that they actually, in the end, that they reign. And we should also remember to that regard that, you know, even in Europe, those ideas were not necessarily held by everybody back in the 1940s or the 1950s or even the 1960s. And that leadership, that ability to lead, to provide that intellectual leadership, to project those ideas and to be confident of their success is a really critical dimension. And beyond that also then is providing the resources, whether it's through international development aid, forms of international prosperity assistance, or in fact the military component, deterring attacks on like-minded states or countries like Ukraine that want to be more like or want to be a part of the Euro-Atlantic community or the broader imagined community of the West, that they can live in peace as well. And beyond that, of course, also the countries we were talking about in the Indo-Pacific.
But coming back to the original question I asked, I'm quite a stubborn guy. The challenges of authoritarian regimes like Putin, who's weaker, of course, there's no doubt about that, and China, which is probably not as strong as people tend to think, but is still a big problem for many, many years to come.
No, but I've answered your question. You know, this is about our counteroffer. You know, there are a number of countries beyond China and Russia that you might call swing states that can go potentially either way or many ways in between. We have to provide a degree of intellectual leadership and provide the new thinking that can create new structures to bridge the divides across the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, and within it to ensure that our way of life that we hold dear actually prevails. So it is all about that counter-offer. We have to provide something which is better than what China and Russia.
Yeah, I understand. But what we're talking about is more like methods of achieving certain interests with inclusion of values. I'm rather sort of, if you wish, trying to understand whether it's the self-feeling of the perceived global West that says, well, this is the red line. We are not going to let, I know, the Chinese or Putin or the mullahs do this. It was about that. I understand that you have to be flexible in dealing with countries in between. Yes, James.
Yeah.
Jim.
First of all, I want to go back to the colonialism point, because I do think it's important. And I think it's important to make a distinction between a discussion of our histories and what's going on in the world today. Because what's going on in the world today is the greatest imperialist and colonialist powers in the world today look a lot more like China and Russia than they do like England and the United States. And I think we ought to have a very, very clear distinction about that. And what's particularly important about that is we increasingly see the Chinese and the Russians reasserting the Soviet-era dialogue about imperialism and colonialism as an instrument of information warfare. And I think we have to unpack those things in an honest way. I think, you know, I take your point, but I think what's going to happen is the space for the non-aligned movement, or, you know, when the elephants trample, when the elephants fight, it's the grass. That neutral space is going to shrink in the world. And that many countries that, and ASEAN's a good example, that would prefer not to make choices. They're increasingly going to find that that's untenable. And I go back to James's point about, then the question is are you with us or against us? And I think there's kind of two very clear categories. One is, it depends, right? If there is a strategic relevance to your place in this order, then as in all great power competition, you are going to get treated differently, right? Whether you want to be part of the club or not, if your geostrategic location and resources are important to us, we're going to want you in the club, right? Then there's the question of other countries about making a choice. And I actually don't like the language of, what do we have to offer to join our club? Like, why should you come join the Mickey Mouse Club? Why don't you because I don't think that works. I don't think foreign assistance works. I don't think, you know, you should argument. I think it has to be a partnership. And for those countries that have to make difficult choices, particularly the ones that maybe aren't the most strategically relevant, they have to decide that they want to be part of that club. I mean, the reason why Taiwan and South Korea and many other countries developed was not about foreign assistance or partnership or democracy or anything else. It was because they wanted that for their people. And I think Ukraine is a good example, right? Ukraine could have very easily gone the other way. It would have been essentially not the easy choice in the sense that you wouldn't have had to defend a country and people wouldn't have to die and you wouldn't have to have 1 million hostages in Russia. But Ukrainians wanted to do this. They wanted to be free and they were willing to fight for that. And so I think that we have to look we have to look at how do we make that partnership work? And as opposed to, you know, what do you guys are going to, you know, here's what the Russians want. What do you guys to offer? So to me, and I'll just end up, the really interesting to watch is countries who are, you know, kind of strategically relevant, and their strategy has really been not kicking the Chinese or the Russians out, because that's just too difficult to do, but it's bringing in the Americans or the Indians or the EU. So if you're a Serbia or a Bangladesh or a Sri Lanka, for example, it's about getting everybody in so nobody can really dominate. I'm not sure that's a sustainable model for them in the long term either. And so I think this is the really, really interesting question, particularly when you get to countries that want to be on this side, but you're never going to be able to give them the full kind of security guarantee and umbrella that you would as if they could just freely join, because they're in essentially, so the Moldovas, the Georgias, the Ukraines of the world. We need to think really how, because if they want to be with us, but it's difficult for us to be, how do we do that? And the problem is we've just let those kind of death spiral, right? Yeah, we'd love to have you in the club. As soon as the Russians leave you alone, let us know and we'll let you in, right? That's never going to happen, and it's going to happen even less now. I mean, the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians, they're going to fight harder for territory.
I will interrupt you here, and because I do want to give some time to the audience to ask questions. And by the way, I call on you to ask questions via the online platform that we have, not only from the audience. But what I want to ask is, you know, in the last 30 years, we've seen many moments, well, okay, let's say 25, when at least in Europe they were saying, oh, this is the event that changed everything forever. You know, okay, 9/11, and then it was Georgia, and then the Crimea and Donbass in 2014 also changed Europe forever, or the West forever, whatever. Now we say that this stage of Putin's 8-year war is changing things again. Does it? Does it really change it for the West that much, Nathalie?
My answer, the reason that I would give for my yes answer to that question is that I think what this war is doing is making us, especially Europe, I mean, I think, you know, one should be careful not to talk about the world, but certainly Europe, we are exiting mentally, in fact, I think we have exited mentally a post-war era, meaning a post-Second World War era, and we're into a pre-inter, not quite clear by definition, you don't know what the future holds in store, era. And I think that is really fundamental in the sense that during that post-war era, there was something called the Cold War. And so in a sense, exiting that post-war era suggests that the era that we're entering is even more the change is even more dramatic than what we saw during the Cold War, that was ultimately fought between two adversaries, Soviet Union and the United States, that had fought kind of on the same side of the hot war, meaning the Second World War. Now there is a hot war going on, and we're on opposing sides. So how all this is going to crystallize into a new steady state, I think, is very, very difficult to imagine, really. So I don't know whether this applies to the world, and I think it will depend to a large extent to the extent to which this war is looked at in the months and years ahead as a subset, in a sense, of a broader confrontation that obviously also includes China. Question mark. And so to the extent that the answer to that question is yes, it will be a global, something fundamental. If not, it will certainly be something very fundamental in Europe.
Looking from down under, please.
Look, I suppose I would say these things are continuous. There might be crisis points which focus the mind, but it is a really long game. And I feel I should respond a bit on, because I've talked about what the West isn't, I should say a bit what I think the West is, as an imagined community, as James said. People who have decided, who have joined, who see themselves on one side of something, and so that might be the West versus Russia. In my region, it might be the West versus China. I think for that reason, we do actually think about how attractive we are. I don't know if it's saying exactly it's a value proposition, but I think you do want to get people to join and to be part of it. I would say the answer to that is it's about shared principles and common vision. That's what you're after. And I think shared principles are different than values. They don't sound so essential, and a lot more people can get behind them. So if you have a shared principle like big countries should not invade small ones, you'd hope that most small and medium-sized countries would get behind that principle. Principles like law of the sea, etc. You can sell those in Asia much better because you're not saying it's a big competition of systems argument. You're saying it's I think you talked about, James, a sort of world order argument. What's our vision for a world that we all want to be in? And I think in the end, that's where the West gets its legitimacy, from adhering to those principles. And I would again say we've got to worry about hypocrisy. We've got to worry, again, if I'm being cruel, everyone on the panel is from a country that supported the invasion of Iraq, which was against those shared principles. We need to deliver both internally on our democracies, but also in terms of those shared principles more generally. And I love the statement I heard from the Prime Minister this morning when he opened the conference. He talked about things like freedom, anti-colonialism, solidarity. That, to me, is a vision that we can all get behind.
James.
Yeah, I think the renewed Russian offensive in Ukraine, I think firstly it marks the end of the teleological period in our sort of history from the 1990s onwards. This shows that the principles that we stand for are not preordained to succeed, that Ukraine now has to fight for its very survival in the same way that others have had to do in the past. But I do wonder whether it also marks, and maybe I'm overthinking this a bit, but it marks the first shot in a quite fundamental change in the global balance of power. And that is that during the Cold War, Europe was central, we all know that. But the objective was to prevent a war in Europe, because if that occurred, the end of the world might be in sight. But I do wonder, and consequently that meant that insofar as struggle or competition took place, it was normally displaced to what was then called the Global South or the Third World. And I wonder today whether the same thing is now occurring, but in a different context. So the Indo-Pacific is now the new center of gravity, and Europe, or the Euro-Atlantic, isn't. So does that mean that we're going to see the displacement of the strategic competition between the great powers being displaced out of the Indo-Pacific and into Europe, into Africa, and into South America?
Yeah, so I think we will know if there is a change if nations align their value and interests. And to your point, if people are saying that we'll know it's a success if we live in a world where big countries don't invade small countries. And I think if you believe that, then you miss the whole boat. Because the reality is in the world today, if a big country invades a small country that nobody cares about, nobody's going to care. So when China invades Tibet, nobody's going to fight for that. And that'll be the future. And if you think anything different, then you're missing the whole boat of what's going on here. So I'd like to specifically talk about Western Europe. And the answer is, ask me in 3 years. Because in 3 years, there's two things that make Russia a significant destabilizing threat to Western Europe. And one is obviously the Russian military, which regardless of how incompetent it is, can kill innocent unarmed people very efficiently and destroy their lives and livelihood. That's a threat. And the other, of course, I think, is the energy threat of corruption or profit or blackmail or whatever. If the transatlantic community can't take those two threats off the table, then in 3 years, Putin will rebuild, if he's still alive, rebuild his capability to be right back where he started. So I'll look 3 years down the road, and if NATO has begun to transform into a forward defense that can defend the blue line and says anything that Russian that crosses that line, we're going to kill it, that to me says people have aligned their interests and their values. And if the transatlantic community can figure out how to deliver reliable, affordable, abundant energy without being dependent on buying energy from your enemy, then I'll say, okay, they've got it. But if the answer is 3 years from now, we've gone back to exactly where we were in 2020, then I would say they haven't grasped the alignment of values and interests.
Interestingly enough, in 3 years, well, 2 years now, Putin will have to reconfirm himself as president if he's alive by that time. But we have slightly under 30 minutes for questions, and in this discussion we didn't touch upon, for example, the Quad as much as I wanted to. Probably you'll ask questions about that. Now, may I ask the technicians, probably if it's possible, lower the light a little bit, because I don't see the... Oh, I will have to stand up then and see who is asking questions. Right, I see the hand over there. Yes, and please introduce yourself. Yeah.
Łukasz Kulesa, Polish Institute of International Affairs. It's a fascinating discussion, but sorry to make it a little bit boring, because I want to ask about the institutional dimension of it. So, you know, whether you call it the West or collective West, free world, would it be good to have some kind of an institutional arrangement bringing these countries together? We had attempts, I think, at this Community of Democracies, Summit for Democracies. In the past, NATO here, CIATO over there, Centro in the center, but you know, somehow it doesn't work. So should there be some kind of an institutional gathering of everybody we considered part of the group? Or are we happy with this current situation of existing and ad hoc groupings and things like the Quad, for example?
Thank you very much. Who wants to take the question? Oh, everyone. Okay. Nathalie, you'll be first, James, and then Jim.
Okay, so I would
Briefly,
say,
please.
Yeah, very quick. Yes and no. Yes, institutions matter, and they matter because a fundamental way of protecting is really, given that I strongly believe that we are actually talking about values, whether they're values, principles, but we're kind of, you know, that stuff, right? And institutions play a fundamental role in that protection. It's not only about defense. Should it be the one institution? No, it should not, because if it were to be one institution, we would be in the West versus rest. And, you know, we saw the problems and the contradictions in the whole democracy summit debate. I don't think that's the way to go. It should be a spaghetti bowl approach to institutions.
That's a very Italian answer.
James, Jim. Yeah.
I'd say in an ideal world, yes. I mean, I want to make very plain that I think that NATO, and particularly the willingness of both Britain and the United States to extend their nuclear systems over the entire alliance and compound those or actualize them through the forward deployments of their conventional forces is absolutely critical to the reason that we have a West in any meaningful sense today. Now, insofar as the Indo-Pacific is now rising in prominence, there does seem to be a disconnect because NATO only covers most of the countries in the Euro-Atlantic region, and it's going to be extended further still to include, hopefully, Sweden and Finland. And in that sense, I'm actually quite enthused by the British Foreign Secretary that has put forward various ideas in a speech recently as to how we might begin thinking about this. Now, of course, there have been lots of different plurilateral initiatives like AUKUS, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and so on and so forth, to try and bind the Indo-Pacific together and to bind it closer to the Euro-Atlantic and vice versa. But these are probably not going to be enough. They're not going to deliver the same impact, the same strategic impact that NATO has delivered over the last 60-odd years. So we also need to think about the geoeconomic as well as the geopolitical dimensions, because the geoeconomic, particularly in relation to the regulation of technology, is increasingly important, particularly when China is such an innovative force in that regard. So firstly, we probably need to start thinking about how we globalize NATO, that doesn't necessarily mean that NATO extends its membership to countries in the Indo-Pacific, but it does mean that we need to think beyond the Euro-Atlantic area. And secondly, we probably need to think about how we enlarge and strengthen the G7 as an actor that can provide a degree of geo-economic leadership and to ensure that technology is regulated to the democracy's advantage and not the autocracies. Jim, Melissa.
Well, okay, you said, because I usually, who I see, I register. No, please.
Okay, I won't waste any more time. I've got a quick one. So I think it's a clear no, okay, August. In, out, either or doesn't work in Asia. I think you've got the G7 if you want the core West, and you can always invite whoever you feel like. We get an invite many years and appreciate. And you've got things like the G20 when you're talking systemically important economies, whether they're part of the West or not.
What a Brussels-like question. We need a process. No, look, the obvious answer is no, and because these things operationalize on the ground, and you have to it has to be driven by what works on the ground. So the Quad to me is an excellent example. The Quad is perfect for Asia. Not only does it unites Japan, it gives a forum for Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. Obviously, I think the three most interested and capable countries of kind of balancing with China. But what's the genius of the Quad is underneath that, there are trilats, there are bilats, and so what you actually have in Asia is a much more flexible instrument. So there's lots of different places you can go to get a problem solved. And I actually think that's infinitely better in Asia. I would never want to see somebody try to do a NATO in Asia. So let me give you the hard one, which we have to start thinking about is, what does that look like for the Atlantic region? Because if China can do everything China wants, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, in a decade, the US and Europe would see the Atlantic as a competitive space, which it hasn't been since we sank the last U-boat in 1945. And from a US perspective, we have no structure for that. There's no one in the US government below the level of the president that thinks holistically about the Atlantic region. And so how you kind of balance interests in Africa and Latin America and the Arctic and the Antarctic, we don't have a system for that. And people need to think about what does that look like if you're serious about that. But I do think actually there needs to be global cooperation. So I mentioned before, I do think there are things that the Asians can do that can help out in the Middle East. I think there are, in Europe. I think that connectivity is going to happen at the national level. It's going to be individual governance that provide the connectivity between these different frameworks, and I'll give you a good example, which is India. I mean, if you look at what the Indians are doing in shifting their policy in the Middle East, in the role they've played in the Indian Ocean, in helping development, India is a country that already gets it, and they've already moved out and started to provide some of that cross-connectivity.
Thanks, Jim. And I saw Paul, I think, raising his hand, and then someone in front, because I'm really blinded by the light. Yeah, so Paul, I think, right? Yes. Good.
Thank you so much. I'm Paul Massaro. I work for the U.S. Congress. This has been a really entertaining panel, absolutely fantastic, on a question that for me is the most important question to answer now as we enter what I see as the second Cold War. So one thing I'm very fond of saying is modern dictatorship relies on access to the West. And that is to say, over the last 30 years, our economic and financial integration has enabled the rise of China, the rise of Putin's kleptocracy, and so on and so forth, whether it's the oligarchs stashing all their money in the West and taking advantage of our gatekeeper industry that is the lawyers and accountants and real estate and so on and so forth, or China, which is a lot more obvious. So I wonder, we all talk about the governments and our visions and our institutions, but what about our private sector? What about that economic integration?
Thank you very much, and I think it touches upon the sweet songs of globalization that were sung before. And now it turned out to be has mostly upsides, but quite a few downsides because of that. James, you were the last to speak. Who wants to? Yes, please, Nathalie. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely right. I mean, I think the point, and I think this, we've talked about, defense and protection and security and defense terms, but actually we can talk about protection in economic terms. Now, the point, and actually, in our very European debate about autonomy and strategic autonomy, let's forget the defense side of it. Let's think about the econ side of it. This is essentially what it's about. Now, I think the point and the challenge is, how do we avoid protection from becoming protectionism? And it's a very, very fine line to walk. But we need to walk that line and find that balance, because if we were to tilt into protectionism, then we may keep the Russians and the Chinese, well, actually the Chinese, who not really the Russians, out, but then we would no longer be who we are.
Thank you. Jim, you wanted to...
Oh, yeah, just real quick. I mean, I'm actually optimistic, because I think the reason why we got it wrong is because we got geopolitical risk wrong, and I think people are going to catch up. That the geopolitical risk has changed, and I believe that we'll adjust to that. The reason why everybody bought cheap Russian oil and gas was because it was more stable than going to the Middle, because the Middle East was unstable, right? So I think I agree with your point, right? And the way we do that is people have to look at contemporary geopolitical risk and realize that it's not what it was 10, 15 years ago. And I already see signs in the market that I think that's happening.
I do not see any hands. So, good, very much. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Polish Institute of International Affairs. My question refers to the issue you have mentioned, which is let's say, all the values which unite us, among which you have mentioned territorial respect for territorial integrity or the sovereignty. And the problem is that China also, let's say, expressly calls these values as very important to it, but reads them in a very different way. So the sovereignty means, let's say, the opportunity to oppress its own people, and in case of the territorial integrity, it's, the ability to claim large parts of the ocean which belong to other states, or at least should belong, or to reconquer Taiwan. So I wonder whether these very
dangerous concepts,
broad concepts should not be defined a little bit more precisely.
Yeah, please. Nathalie,
I mean, I think that those are necessary but not sufficient pieces of the equation. And they're necessary because part of that values box is kind of international law, and that's the bedrock of international law. But given that that is international law, it's not Western law, that is obviously shared with others. Now, as I said, necessary but not sufficient, what then makes it sufficient is that we do get into the liberal democracy box and the human rights and the rule of law and the political participation and the all good things. And we cannot escape that one. And that is why, when we talk about how do we protect ourselves, it is about, yes, indeed, protecting ourselves from the baddies out there, but it's also, frankly speaking, protecting ourselves from the baddies inside.
Right. I think that what the colleague from Poland asked is very interesting, because I don't see any hands right now. Over there. I'll give you the word, don't worry, but there's something that I wanted to follow up after this question. And that is, if you look at maybe Melissa will start also, if you look at the global West, or whatever you call it, the free world, right? And several of you, I think James and Nathalie definitely, mentioned that we are in a new territory, which is post-Cold War. And a lot of principles and institutions that are inherited come from a different age. So, for example, should for simplicity, let's call it the global West, aim at completely overhauling the United Nations? Should it say to the Japanese, well, thank you very much, you're now earned your pardon, you don't have to call your forces a Japanese self-defense force, and you can expand if you want to? Lots of legacies, if you come to think of it. How to deal with them? Maybe Melissa, you can start.
No, thanks. I think I can answer that a bit and respond to the question. I see some of these things as exceptionally long-term trends that are just inherent in the international system. So, for example, great powers want to do what they want to do, and small and medium powers try to build up systems to constrain them of international law, of institutions, etc., etc. And I see that as always happening. That's just part of the system that we live in. So from that side, I think that would be my answer.
No, good. Anyone wants to? Yeah, James, please.
Yeah, I think firstly we should probably stop using the Cold War as a point of kind of historical reference. And I think that's important in the modern context because in many ways the situation that existed after the Second World War was unique. You had, the Soviet Union was already a greatly overextended power, and it was basically an issue of crystallizing and then deterring the Soviet Union from further aggression. Whereas today, when we're talking about China, you have a country that is a bit more maybe like Germany at the beginning of the First World War, that has the potential for considerable expansion across multiple different levels and across numerous different planes. And therefore, the situation is much more volatile and precarious. And whereas we had a number of leaders, I would say, after the Second World War that understood the consequences of failing to act, failing to create those structures that are necessary to prevent war, to prevent an aggressive state from taking control, I'm afraid I'm not sure that we have leaders today, whether in the Euro-Atlantic or the Indo-Pacific, that understand that because they haven't lived through it and they haven't experienced it. They've lived through times of peace and plenty beyond small wars on the grand scheme of things that are occurring in places like the former Yugoslavia, the Middle East, or today, of course, in Ukraine.
So she is the Kaiser, but there is no General Pershing. Anyone wants to add to that? Anyone wants to comment on cracking down on P5 or something like that?
Is really the fundamental question. I must say, I've been kind of really scratching my head on this question for the last kind of 3 months. Yeah. I don't have a good answer to it because I think you're absolutely right. All of these institutions were created in that post-war era. Now, if we're moving away from it, what does it entail? Now, do we just scrap them? Well, on one level, well, no, it wouldn't be a very good idea. But to the extent that they are corroded from within, does it lead, maybe in a very inertial way, to other things kind of popping up? This is why I made reference to spaghetti bowls, because I think that not necessarily out of choice, but out of necessity, that may well be where we're headed.
I completely disagree. I don't think it's the fundamental question. I think the fundamental question in the world is force. If you don't have the force to protect your interests, you're screwed. And these organizations aren't going to save you. So the first thing you have to be able to do is to protect your interests. Once you can protect your interests, then I think you can talk about triaging these international organizations, which I've always thought were really supplemental to governance. And I think the challenge is just saying international organizations is kind of inadequate because there's such a plethora of them, and they have varying values and varying importance. And I think you have to kind of start by focusing on the ones which can actually supplement and impact what nation states are doing, and then you have to make some hard choices. If they're completely irredeemable, then you need to go off and build something new. And I think perhaps the WHO is an example. Maybe it's time to say, thank you, but that's not working for me. And then there are organizations that I think can be reformed. And we've actually seen, I think, a lot of impressive efforts, because we've all seen the Chinese make a very deliberate effort over the last decades or so to really influence and penetrate international organizations. And we've actually seen, I think, a lot of pushback on that, and a lot of understanding of that threat, and a lot of people trying to challenge that. And so maybe it's reform. And then maybe it's just something we'll just ignore it. So that to me is another level of kind of hard thinking about it. I think we have to stop thinking about international organizations good and start saying about let's look at our interests and our values and weigh that against what that organization provides, and then have a strategy on how to deal with it.
Just push back, just a Ukraine pushback on this point. If
we have to remember
organizations were not that important, why does Ukraine strive so much to enter both the European Union and NATO? It forces very well if you're the United States, right?
Let me put it this way. There's a reason why Sweden and Finland want to join NATO, and it's not to be defended by Brussels, Paris, and Berlin.
There was a question over there. I feel like, you know, Richard Burton in the last shot of The Spy Who Came In from the Cold, completely blinded by the light. So whoever was that, please stand up and introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, Patrick Kugiel. I'm also from the Polish Institute of International Affairs. I have a follow-up question. I wanted to say I agree with what Melissa Conley and Nathalie Tocci said, that framing the current situation in the kind of competition between the West and the rest is divisive and is useless. And we may need more inclusive approach, which means that we need possibly to consider rewriting the rules of the game. Because when we have many countries, many important countries that did not condemn the Russian aggression and did not join the sanctions on Russia, this is possibly because they didn't feel kind of obliged to protect the rules-based order, because they always ask which rules are we going to defend. That the system that is currently is privileging the West, and so they feel no obliged to defend it. So are we ready possibly to engage the rest, the global South, the emerging powers, to reshape the current order, to reform the institutions, to jointly write the rules of the game? Thank you.
Thank you. James volunteered first. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just don't agree with the premise of the question, because I don't think it is an issue of the West versus the rest. And I think that's really important to point out. So I think we should refrain from framing it in those terms. This is more about countries, whether big or small, or even to some extent authoritarian or democratic, those that support a free and open international order, where all countries can pursue their interests relatively freely, unconstrained, and those who do not accept that order and want to impose on it some kind of neo-imperial or some kind of special exemption from that order, and to impose that on countries around them or even on the global level. So I think that's actually how we should frame it. And if you think of it in that sense, it's actually very inclusive. And it allows for many different countries to become a part of it, and they are part of it. The issue then becomes, you know, you need to actually step up and help to underpin that system. And then, of course, the issue then is the force that's required to underpin it, because there is force underneath any system or any order, ultimately. And then beyond that, what institutions are going to be used to arrange it and to make that force in some ways legitimate.
Melissa, briefly, please. Yeah.
Very briefly. I agree with you, we shouldn't frame it as Western versus rest, but I think we actually do, empirically. So Patrick and I, for example, were at the Raisina Dialogue in India, and that's exactly what was being said over and over again. And that's not attractive to Indians. If you say, will you stand up for the liberal international order? Will you stand up for US primacy? Literally, there was a US person who stood there and said, that's what we want. No, India's not going to sign up for those things. As you say, what India, for example, might sign up for is a rule-based international order on shared principles that benefit all of us. And that's where I think our discussion should be.
I see Jim strongly disagreeing, but very strongly, but briefly. Strongly, but briefly.
No, I was at Raisina. I came away with exactly the opposite thing. I mean, India is a good example of, it's not West versus the rest. India has come up with a transformative foreign policy in the last decade, in which it's integrating to deal with global challenges extremely well. And they don't mind working with the United States because we're part of the West. So I don't get it. I think your point's exactly right. It shouldn't be framed that way. And I think countries that are facing real challenges, like China on your border, they don't really worry a lot about that. They worry about China being on their border.
Look, we have 5 minutes left, and I would like to ask, I think, certainly a relevant question, but I would like it to be very brief, and I'll be terribly rude cutting you. We were talking about this, what the West is. Okay, what if we're talking about the authoritarians on the other side, meaning first and foremost, of course, China and Russia, and well, probably Iran, not as powerful as they are. What does the West eventually would like from them? how does it want to win against them? Does it want to what should it want? Should it want to win? Should it want to contain? Should it want to dissolve and absorb? What's your view? Very briefly, who wants to start? James.
Sure, I think it's actually very similar to the, in the past. We need to contain until their systems are proven to be less efficient and less successful than our own.
Nathalie.
I mean, I think that we have to assume that we will be living in a non-liberal world in which these illiberal powers will coexist with liberal ones and lots of shades of grey in between. And I think that the aim should basically be that of proving that our model of governance delivers better public goods to our citizens.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Very Biden, absolutely.
Right.
I agree. Finding international rules of the road that enable liberal and illiberal systems to coexist in the world for the time being.
Right. Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to what I said originally. I mean, we believe we like human rights, we like our freely elected governments, and we like the free market system. And we want people to stop trying to take that away from us. And that, I think, is what our real interest is.
Thank you, and we have an auction. There is one last question you can ask very briefly if anyone wants to. That is your last chance. I don't have a hammer, but please volunteer someone if you want to. That's your last chance. No hands. Well, then we are pretty much even we beat the schedule. It's 3 minutes left. Peter, I would like to thank my co-panelists, Melissa, James, Nathalie, and Jim, and I hand it to Peter.
Thank you, Konstantin.